All right. Well, once again, welcome to our panel on nonviolence and civil disobedience in the context of our charism. We're so delighted that you're with us for this program, and we look forward to the good conversation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Sister Janet Lander, serving currently as the Vice President of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Concordia, Kansas, as well as being a former educator, a missionary, and retreat director. She's the co-author of what we recommended you might look at in advance for today, which is The State of the Heart and Order of the House, A Way of Nonviolence. Her other current engagements include being an instructor for new members and associates, teaching bobbin lace, social justice ministry, and offering spiritual direction. She holds graduate degrees from Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles and Boston College. We'll also hear from Sister Deirdre Griffin, who's the executive director of the Federation, an immigration attorney. She lived at the U.S.-Mexico border from 2022 to 2025 with the Maryknoll lay missioners. There she was accompanying people seeking safety at Annunciation House shelter and also providing legal services. Sister Deirdre recently risked arrest and was detained in the U.S. Capitol during interfaith gathering to draw attention to those suffering from violence perpetrated by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Our third panelist is Marty Roers, who has served as the director of the CSSJ Justice Office for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, St. Paul Province for 10 years. The St. Paul Province's Justice Commission has a variety of issue-focused justice working groups. Prior to Marty's work with the CSJs, he was with the Archdiocesan Catholic Charities Office for Social Justice. He also served in college campus ministry and then as a Maryknoll lay missioner in East Africa and Central America. And so we're so grateful for their time and wisdom that they'll be sharing with us. And we'll invite Sister Janet to begin with her remarks. Then we'll have Sister Deirdre and then Marty, and then we'll open it up for questions after the three of them have each shared. So again, welcome, and we'll begin.
Thank you, Sister Bethany. And it's good to be with all of you. I'm going to share with you a little bit of my own story with nonviolence and the spirituality that undergirds it for me as a sister of St. Joseph, especially that of discerning love, so needed in order to live nonviolence. But first, I ask you to consider, has a spirit of nonviolence taken root in your heart? When? When did you awake to the need to be about the work of the peace of Christ, to stand as witness against violence? What seized your heart? I began college just as the Vietnam War ended, and discussion was going on about passing the Equal Rights Amendment. That would have made mandatory the draft for women as well as men. In prayer at that time, I came to a deep knowing that I could not and would not enlist should it be required, that I would rather sit in prison than be trained to kill or collaborate with a system of violence. Well, we all know the ERA did not pass, and I was not put to the test. But a couple of years later, my first year teaching, I had again to face the question, not just where is my heart, but where are my feet? During the very first week of school, I gave a creative writing assignment to my sixth graders to dream about where they might be 10 years in the future. All seemed to be going well when I noticed a boy in the back of the room sitting with his arms crossed across his chest and a look of annoyance on his face. After class, I asked him what was going on for him. I will never forget his response. "Why should I do such a pointless writing assignment?" he said. I asked how it was pointless, and he said, "I am quite sure that by 10 years from now, all of us will have been killed by a nuclear holocaust." I was stunned, but I thanked him for his honesty. As soon as the school day was over, I went straight to the principal's office and talked to Sister Maureen, who was a wisdom woman for me at that time. And she suggested that both of us join an anti-nuclear group that had just formed in our civic community. That began my history of choosing to live nonviolence, even before I was clear about how it was connected to the gospel. In that first situation, you can see the movement of the heart in personal prayer. In the second, we see the movement of the heart and feet through interpersonal or communal discernment, which I didn't do just with the boy in the back row, but with my community afterwards. Now, that was 45 years ago. And in the intervening time, I have studied and taught, written, and given retreats on nonviolence, participated in public witness both in the US and Brazil. And 37 years ago, I took the Pax Christi vow of nonviolence, which I privately renew every year on Christmas Day as I give thanks that Jesus, the peace of God, chooses to dwell among us as one of us. This vow has become a springboard for gospel nonviolence for me, and we heard some of the words straight from the vow in our prayer this day. For me, the spirituality of active nonviolence also springs just from lived experience and from contemplation of Jesus, who I believe is the nonviolent face of the God of peace. It grows in contemplation of the vow that I keep trying to live and keep renewing. And it is nourished by the spirit and spirituality, charism, and mission of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Now, I will leave the contemplation of Jesus to you, but I would like to say a little bit more about the vow and then focus on some of our lived spiritual tradition. The vow of nonviolence begins with the personal recognition of the ongoing need for conversion from violence to peacemaking or reconciliation, as called for by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, the vowed person commits not just to striving for inner peace, but also to accepting suffering rather than inflicting it, refusing to react and retaliate, persevering in nonviolence of tongue and lifestyle, and striving to end racism, poverty, to abolish war, and diminish all other forms of violence. I can simply say that this vow stretches me, really stretches me, towards ever greater love. In it, I find resonance with the invitations offered to us in the maxims of how we are to be in relationship with the dear neighbor and with the self. Our other vows also call us to be nonviolent to every sort of neighbor without distinction, as well as how we relate to power and material goods in the world. Our fourth vow of profound humility and cordial charity, found in the primitive constitution, I find to be utterly transformative. Living in humble charity is profoundly nonviolent. In July of 2005, during Bearers of the Tradition Phase 2, Sister Teresa Cavalli, Crondelet's sister, two former members of my congregation, and I wrote the booklet that you all received in the link. That is a link between nonviolence and our practice of state of the heart and order of the house. Even though I know you can read the book on your own, I would like to make a few observations. Shortly after we wrote that book, the Concordia community invited Father John Deere to give the congregation a retreat on gospel nonviolence. During the course of the retreat, he often dipped back into his Jesuit roots, which, through Father Madai, are also our roots. One day he talked about the way Ignatius required the men to have daily spiritual conversations during a half an hour walk with a brother or two. There were four purposes to this spiritual practice. First, for members to become more adept in articulating their experience of God and in the living of mission. Second, to guide discernment in community. Third, to inspire or animate one another by revealing the face of God to each other. And fourth, to deepen friendship in order to build community. Some of us retreatants noticed a clear connection of these purposes with the outcomes of State of the Heart and Order of the House in St. Joseph communities. Of course, the prerequisite is fruitful sharing, is a faithful prayer life grounded in discerning love and the practice of the daily examen of consciousness that helps keep us aware of God's action in us, through us, and with the neighbor. Sharing the state of the heart and then following it with the order of the house is, I believe, doing communal discernment. As touched upon in our primitive document, the Règlement, the state of the heart and order of the house, though not named as such there, is consistent with these prayer conversations in community that allow us to be more deeply transformed and guided in our living of mission. Our active and inclusive nonviolence is the face of active and inclusive love, which is so needed in our world today. In the state of the heart and order of the house, as in synodal listening, there are three basic movements. The first is the storying of our lives, recounting the graced experience of one's life and mission, or where we have encountered God. One by one in community, we tell our story of grace. It is listened to with receptive reverence. In the next movement, we look for common threads. If this is so, then what is God doing among us in our community by being at work in each person's life? The third movement is naming the discerned call of God to the community based on what God is doing among us in our lives as they are. In this process, we are engaging the reality of the world to know what is ours to do in living our charism of unioning love in all its dimensions now. Our world has so much in common with the time of the women in Le Puy. They were founded in a time of plague and war, violence, poverty, and chaos. Father Madai gave them a way of life grounded in the primitive documents, which I believe was a nonviolent path by which they bore witness to the great love of God in their world as it was. I am certain that this is no less possible for us as we encountered the great love of God in our world and then embody this great love in our time of history. A spirituality of nonviolence can support our efforts, no matter the facet of justice ministry we are in, or the daily lives we are living, that all call for our total self-gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and grateful to have the opportunity to thank you for the gift of the materials that you prepared, because it really has been just a delight to discover this treasure as we started exploring our own awareness that nonviolence is an important aspect of our Christian, human, and CSSJ approach to life to raise up at this time. So it was a gift that was broken open again and being broken open again today. As Bethany shared, I'm Sister Deirdre Griffin, currently serving as the Executive Director of our Federation. And I'm grateful for the invitation to share because it's been a great opportunity to reflect on a couple of aspects of my own life and to name out loud that this journey striving to be a companion of Jesus in the way of Sisters of St. Joseph is indeed a journey, and a journey in community, and that this way of growing into, I would say, nonviolence is something that deepens over time and in community. And I think aligns well with our understanding of ourselves across the communities of St. Joseph, that it's a call to each of us, wherever we are and however we are able. And that it is an active, creative engagement for the sake of the gospel. Some people say, oh, nonviolence, that just means be nice to people. Well, no, it means be nice to people and again, that understanding that social justice is constitutive to the gospel, right? If we're taking that seriously, then each of us is being transformed in all of those interactions. And for me personally, just to share a little bit so that it might model for you how to reflect on your own life and see where your right next steps might be. I grew up as the child of Irish immigrant parents in Boston in the 1970s and 80s. And when I was in high school with the Sisters of St. Joseph there, we had a class on social justice and nonviolence. And that led me to have conversations at the kitchen table in my home with my parents and my uncles about Northern Ireland. At that time, the violence in Northern Ireland was at a height. And here I was studying nonviolence and hearing these very dynamic discussions down to the point of which events would we go to, which Irish step dancing competitions would we participate in, depending on whether they were sponsored by the Irish Northern Aid or a certain group. And so it made it very real for me. And the gift for me there was to say, wow, I am invited to discern my way in the best sense that I can, and I can never know what it's like to be in another person's shoes, and not to judge. So that awareness stayed with me, and over time and in community was blessed to cross paths with some wonderful mentors, including John Deere, who Janet mentioned, and also Sister Jane Morrissey in our community in Springfield, who I say has a rap sheet for civil disobedience that I can only aspire to. And the deepening that was able to happen through our regular meetings with Pax Christi. And I can remember, being in my late 20s, early 30s, and going to these Western Mass Pax Christi meetings and thinking, okay, here we are, we pray and we study. When do we act? And feeling frustrated at times. Yeah, we talk about this, but what are we doing? And it was a wonderful, again, another foundation to raise awareness for myself that it matters where I put my body. It matters what I do with this awareness. And from there were two other quite pertinent development moments. One was working in the food pantry at our neighborhood house in Springfield and encountering a couple from Iran who were clearly professional people who had been displaced by the violence there. And realizing that at the time, I was aware, and also of the invasion in Iraq, the US attack in Iraq as well, that there were two things. One was I had to choose not to retaliate. I had to choose to be willing to die rather than have my country exercise tremendous violence against another country. And then the other was to apologize to these people, that sense of my country is doing this. I have some sense of responsibility for this. And in that interaction, saying to that man, I don't know exactly what to say to you because it's not what I wanted to have happen, but I know that my country has done this to your family. And he gave me the tremendous gift of saying, our governments are fighting with each other. We are two people face to face, and we are the ones who build peace for the future. So as ever, as you're trying to serve, the grace comes to you. And that really, part of the gift was that it freed me up. It made me a bit more courageous to try to do that more and more, including my time at the border, as Bethany mentioned. I think it's important for us also to be aware as we discern what is ours to do in this realm of nonviolence, to be aware of our positions in social structures and in our society, and that's an important part of knowing what is ours to do and naming what is ours to risk, what can we lay down for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of nonviolence. And for me, that was part of the decision to go to the US-Mexico border. I was so angry and I refused to be paralyzed. And I thought, what can I do? And so that invitation to just put everything that had been entrusted to me at the foot of the cross in service of folks who were arriving seeking protection was the right answer at that time. And again, community deepening there. Folks who live at the border are keenly aware of how policies impact people's lives, vulnerable people's lives, which can happen in a variety of settings. For me, that happened to be where I was. And the deepening sense of community building, which is something that I realized in listening to the reports from Minneapolis. So much of what is possible there right now seems to be arising from the strength of community networks that existed already. And I think that's where I say, don't minimize anything that you feel invited to do, because it's all preparation to be ready for when you know it's the moment for you to take a different kind of action. Which for me leads to our spirituality. Anybody who knows me knows that I love the maxims. Whenever I feel a little unsure of where am I or what's mine to do, when I can find the state of my heart in the dynamics of the maxims, it always helps me see what's the next loving thing. So I would name two dynamics in the maxims and in our spirituality. One of this courageous communion that we're called to, and the other is the attentiveness to grace. And all at the same time of becoming more and more aware of our ego and how we can opt into that self-emptying that makes us available. So when I look at maxims 49 and 50, this sense of deference to the neighbor, compliance to the neighbor, so far as it does not offend God, right? So this gentleness, this active, inclusive love also has limits so that we don't fall into the shadow side of complicity or complacency. That, again, provided that God is not offended, defer to the neighbor. So there are moments when there's a shift to be made, when there's a healthy confrontation to have, that becomes the courageous communion. And then the other is at Maxim 84, which is, never go ahead of grace by an imprudent eagerness. In that sense of getting fired up when I see something that I know is unjust, and I want to just jump in and say, take me, let's go get arrested and make a scene, and sometimes for some people that's the right answer. But over time, for me, it has been very refining to stay faithful to that commitment to doing this in community. And that helps me recognize, yes, these emotions and this righteous anger is important information. And then how can I also give that to God in community to discern what are we called to do together so that we can also enter into deeper and deeper spaces of changing structures and raising awareness. And so the last bit that I'll share is about the experience on the 29th of January, participating in civil disobedience at the US Capitol. And all those experiences that I shared really had prepared me for the moment when I was on a Zoom call, listening to an interfaith organizing call, to know deep in my own self, this is the time. This is something that I am called to do. And it happened, again, part of what made it the right answer was I was now in New York. I could hop on a train and go to DC, and our relationships with Network made it possible, and with LCWR, made it possible to do that in community. And just a couple of insights from that experience. One, that it was an interfaith experience, and that as a group, we were beautifully aware of our unity and diversity, and that we needed to share both the responsibility and the burden of this action, meaning that there were many people of color who were participating in this action, which was mostly ministers, ordained ministers. And among us to share the gifts of leading song, and also to be aware that even at a relatively low risk experience like being at the Capitol, which was all very well communicated and managed, that the risk of violence was always going to be greater for our siblings of color and for transgender folks who were participating in that action. And I was very much taken with our discernment as a group before we went to the Capitol, for people to pray about that and to acknowledge, yes, I will, one, I will be a witness. Two, I will sit, which was the action. The violation of law that day was our singing in the Capitol building, in the Senate office building, because we were disturbing the work of Congress. That was the violation. So we sang all the way to the building, were entered in silence, and then at a shared sign, we all sat down and started singing again. And that was when the officers came out to arrest us. And the singing continued, and it gentled the experience for everyone, including the officers, who seemed a bit unsure about what to do for the 3 hours that we were gently singing. You are not alone. Together we are creating liberation. And lastly, I have to say, as a woman religious, my experience in this realm has really raised up the prophetic dimension of our vocation, the prophetic dimension of our vocation as Christians, and an understanding of Catholicism as countercultural, but particularly as non-ordained leaders within our church. This gathering was for faith leaders, and your Catholic faith leaders that day were a longtime Maryknoll missioner and leader in nonviolence, Marie Dennis; Jean Stoken from the Sisters of Mercy, again, decades-long activist in nonviolence; Dan Moriarty, a lay missioner; and myself. There wasn't a Catholic priest or bishop caller to be seen. And it was a very good opportunity again for me to reflect about that, to be to own the frustration, and then also to own the privilege of being able to live in a way that we can see these things and make these choices. And then, just recently, to have our cardinals speak very publicly on 60 Minutes in their role within the church, and I wept, saying, finally they are speaking publicly about these things. So again, to know ourselves as part of a whole, to journey in community with compassion and with courage. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Deirdre and Janet and Bethany, for your sharing. Deirdre, I think it's just inspiring to hear that how singing is an act of resistance. And I guess that's what I'm going to reflect upon, is a little bit how I've seen not only the CSJ community, but also the community here in the Twin Cities responding in what I would consider very nonviolent ways, as acts of resistance, especially during the last few months of Operation Metro Surge. I know that there are others from the Twin Cities also on this call. And so I share this knowing that they've been there together in these actions of nonviolence here in the Twin Cities. But it is rooted deeply in the Carondelet community's own witness of being a community. A violent-free zone is our retirement center here. The sisters made a commitment years ago to be a nonviolent community, and we have icons in our community as well, like the Sisters for Peace, the McDonald Sisters, and many others who have shown up in so many spaces. But the play a few years ago, the Sisters of Peace, was just a wonderful way of engaging not only this community, but the broader community in these conversations of nonviolence. And so, as I reflect on the last few months in particular, it really struck me on a really cold day in January when it was a minus 20 degrees and 50,000 Minnesotans showed up nonviolently on the streets in Minneapolis and marched and sang, and how singing has become such a sign of really nonviolence in this times. But what struck me the most, not only the 50,000 people who showed up, but I was really amazed at the most common sign, physical sign, protest sign that people were carrying during the marches was the simple words, love your neighbor. I mean, I'm not just talking hundreds of signs, I'm talking thousands of signs. The most common sign I saw throughout the march was this simple message of love your neighbor. And it got me thinking, and I came back to the community and we shared and reflected on the different actions that we've been taking. And a member of our retirement community that evening during the prayer was rather insistent, I'm not doing enough. I want to be doing more. And as we sat and reflected and began to share, slowly the community began to realize, well, I've been doing this and someone else has been doing that. And we began to realize as a community, we have been responding nonviolently. And I think that's been probably the biggest lesson of the last few months here in the Twin Cities is how, not just in an organized fashion, but individuals have been showing up and doing what they can for their neighbor. And it was simple things like going and getting groceries or helping out and giving a neighbor a ride to work so they did not have to drive and have that threat of being stopped. Or simple things of checking in on a neighbor, especially an immigrant neighbor that has been very afraid to leave their homes. And those simple acts of kindness really were acts of nonviolence, acts of resisting the system that was really working to oppress our immigrant neighbors and create a sense of fear in the Twin Cities with the 3,000 to 4,000 agents in the Twin Cities, and yet tens and hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans showed up in other ways, physically showing up to help their neighbor, but also showing up in acts of prayer, prayer vigils, or singing on street corners. I just remember one night leaving work and I must have passed 100 different little gatherings of community standing on street corners with candles and singing. Just 2 weeks ago here, the retirement community gathered on our street corner and we had 500 neighbors join us for a simple rally on our street corner. It's just been wonderful to see the ways that Minnesotans have been showing up. And sometimes it's the CSJs spark it, and in other ways, we show up for others. So I know there are colleagues here on this call who have been doing the humble actions that I've shown up with them, standing outside of schools and daycare centers so that um, especially workers, immigrant workers at daycare centers felt safe to get into the building to do their jobs and to work with children, so that children would feel safe going to school by knowing that there were community members standing outside of their schools. This happened in so many places, but it was sisters, consociates, but tens of thousands of everyday Minnesotans showing up to support their neighbors. The countless prayer vigils that have gone on and the ways that people have shown up to financially support not only individuals, but those organizations like the clinics and legal organizations and just helping people with rent in Minnesota. And just, again, the many, many ways that people just are turning out and showing that there is a different way in love and nonviolence. I just think it's just very, very inspiring. I laugh now because years later, when I was a campus minister, I took a group of students to a couple of nonviolent trainings with Reverend James Lawson in Los Angeles. And he always talked about there are 27 different ways to be actively involved in nonviolent ways. And I thought, 27? I was lucky I could think about 3 or 4 at the time. And uh, Sister of St. Joseph came up to me recently and shared with me a handout from community organizers that lists 198 ways to not non-violently be involved in your community. And I'm still just baffled and and amazed that there are just so many ways we can show up nonviolently to counter um, what's going on in our world and our community today. So I think I'll leave and close with that, but very inspired to be with the CSJs and continuing this work together with others.
Thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to open it up for questions. So I'm going to add some spotlights here so that we can see everybody. Did I lose Marty? Where's Marty? There we go. All right, all four of you. Or all three of you and then me. We will open it up for questions. If you want to raise your hand, feel free to do so. If you'd like to put a question in the chat. And while you're thinking, I'm going to pose one to the panelists and then we'll go from there. So all three of you spoke in different ways about telling what Janet used the specific words, telling our story of grace. So I heard your stories in recounting that. How can the storytelling become an important act of nonviolence I'm thinking as a newer member of the Sisters of St. Joseph, like I don't have some of that legacy of story, right, in our congregations. I know it's there, but my newness and the shift and the change in our demographics means I'm not encountering those women face to face. So when I came across the nonviolence pamphlet from Bearers of the Tradition, like this is the stuff. So how might we across the Federation and then individually, perhaps in our congregations, keep some of those stories of grace front and center so that we can be learning from them and growing together?
Well, I have a sense that we've had these stories of grace since we came together on day one, whatever we consider our day one, whether it was Lipwe or our individual communities being founded. And I know that my own community, which bloomed on the frontier, as it were, has all kinds of stories of courage and daring and boldness. And even if they were not anything like the current reality that we're seeing in our country, they met their reality in their day with grace. And I think anytime that we remember those women, that is a way of storytelling. But I don't think it's just that. I think we all have our moments of grace. And although we can certainly share them when we come together in discerning prayer at State of the Heart, sharing them over the dinner table, sharing them with the people that we invite into our homes, asking them for their stories in return. I think there's so many ways to lift up the stories that are among us. And each of them carries grace, not just for the story bearer, but for the listener who will go forth inspired.
To pick up from that, certainly the sharing the state of the heart practice has been part of that in my experience, and sharing it with a consistent group over time. For me, it also ties into this awareness of being conscious of where I put myself, where I put my body, where I spend my time. Nonviolence by inherently has to disrupt our normal, less conscious ways of doing things. And so spaces, I know for me, whenever I'm in a setting with folks who are recently arrived to the United States, to hear their journeys, which often include stories of surviving tremendous violence, and then in ministry and refugee resettlement, the privilege of accompanying folks and helping to create spaces for them to share their stories as part of healing has been inspiring for me. Yeah. And choosing to participate in a nonviolent action, right? One of my first experiences with Sister Jane Morrissey was going out to Los Alamos in New Mexico with John Deere and his Sackcloth and Ashes witness against nuclear weapons. And so to be in the company of other people who are literally putting one foot in front of the other and walking this path together, and to have those experiences of people yelling at you, spitting at you, and the lived practice of claiming the Beatitudes, right, in your body, has been meaningful for me.
And I would just simply share, I mean, especially coming off of the Justice Federation gathering last week, that we have to share so many stories of the ways we nonviolently show up. It's not just the getting arrested or I'll call it the great headline grabbing ways we do that, but there are so many other ways. Um, we have artists in our community that continually remind us of the nonviolent ways, through artwork, through gathering. And I just share, again, another humble, simple example here from the Twin Cities. The sisters hosted one of the monthly immigration vigils outside of the Whipple Federal Building. And we very intentionally invited the Archbishop, and his opening remarks were, how can I say no to the sisters? If they're going to show up, I have to show up. And so how we leverage some of those stories as well. And I think we show up in so many ways, and let's continue to honor and share those.
So I just recalled sharing the sort of timeless stories, when I think about the story of Sadako and the paper cranes, right? That's sort of a universal, accessible story that ties into a contemplative activity of origami and peace crane making that always surprises me wherever you show up with some origami paper and a little copy of that book to talk about the story. It's a very accessible entry point for people through story.
Thank you so much. We have two questions in the chat, and so maybe I'll just do the first one is really practical, logistics oriented. Sister Deirdre, how did your group gain access to the Capitol during your particular nonviolent witness?
Sure. So we were organized by a local interfaith organization in Washington, D.C., which has ongoing working relationships with the Capitol Police. And so when the timing became clear that the Senate would be voting on a budget amendment that would have increased funding for violent immigration enforcement, that group was the nucleus that mobilized and then invited others who could come to join them. So the leaders of that group actually reached out to the Capitol Police, which is not uncommon, to let them know that we were coming and so that they would be prepared. And as I mentioned, we gathered in an interfaith prayer service prior to going to the Senate office building, which is where we were actually arrested. And we walked and sang all the way there. But then when we got to the doors, we stopped singing and entered through security, like any person would from the public, and entered into the rotunda and formed a circle in the rotunda. And from there, sat down and started singing again.
Another question would be for anyone on the panel. This is about prayer vigils and pastoral accompaniment at immigration detention centers. So sounds like this guest is located or situated near Los Angeles. And so that might be another conversation about the geography. We can certainly connect with people out in Orange and LA. Oh, sorry, Louisiana, not LA, not Los Angeles, Louisiana. We do have sisters in Louisiana. We can talk about that, but maybe just generally, the piece around pastoral accompaniment and what we're often calling now clergy access for pastoral care in immigrant detention centers. So maybe if we could start with Marty, because I know that's a pressing issue right now, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, I would start with, there's probably three aspects of this question. I mean, one is I think just the prayer vigil outside of the building is one piece. We've been doing a monthly prayer vigil outside of the federal building for literally the last 10 years, once a month. We tried to initially organize the vigils around the time that immigrant detainees were being brought to the courthouse. And so trying to figure out what's the timing and when you do a vigil and who's your audience. So Initially, it was for the immigrant detainees being brought in from detention centers to the federal courthouse. Um, Secondly, we also then needed to change for a variety of reasons, but trying to be there as families come into a company or friends try and accompany people who are going through the court system. And then thirdly, it was just trying to be there as a community of witnesses and to support one another in this work. So the vigil aspect is thinking probably about the when and the where. And then I think, as Bethany has alluded to, for us, it's also been because the federal building here in Minnesota was never designed as a detention center. And sadly, there have been horrific reports of the conditions that people are being detained and held in those, um, I will call it rooms, because they're not really detention facilities. But all that being said, um, there's been a lot of conversations about nobody was getting access, not even our elected officials, our Congress people could not get access to the building to see the conditions and see the number of folks that were being held there. And so pastorally, we were trying to find ways of not only the pastoral visits, but simple things that we forget about, of bringing ashes on Ash Wednesday, for example, or the washing of the feet for the Holy Week services. And then more consistently now is allowing pastoral visits from clergy of all stripes so that we can visit with folks to make sure that we can pray with them or bring communion to them. And that's been a long road, but thanks through connections with the Federation in Bethany, the lawsuits have opened those doors for us to get into to at least the federal building, and see the conditions and see the detainees and pray with them and know that they're not forgotten.
If anyone else wants to comment from the panel on that, they're welcome to. We also have a question about clarifying the difference between civil disobedience and nonviolent action. So Sister Betty McVeigh said, civil disobedience causes some people to be fearful. Does anybody want to speak to that distinction, if you see them as a distinction?
And start us off. I'm not an expert, but first to the detention center question, I think it speaks to an important grace of this moment, which is that there are a variety of groups who are working in those areas and to gain access in a variety of places. And so just always good to try to scout around to your local interfaith groups or immigration advocacy organizations or even refugee resettlement organizations who might know someone, if there is someone already working on that. So you can join forces rather than trying to reinvent the wheel against a very thick wall toward access for one person to try to figure out on their own. Personally, I guess I think of civil disobedience as a form of nonviolent action. I think nonviolent action is the very broad scope that we've talked about today with all these great examples, with from prayer and contemplation to neighborly actions to civil disobedience. And in my limited experience, I suppose it would be true for all those things. Part of the purpose of nonviolent action, including civil disobedience in a particular way, I guess, is a public witness, a public testimony, and also challenging a very specific legal construct in a collective way. For me, I really had to think through, okay, so I'm going to contest this government action of allocating more money for violence perpetrated by the government. Doesn't feel like it's gonna, save anybody's life or anything. But the importance of that is doing that in a group. One is the experience of community in experiencing that civil disobedience action. The second is raising the awareness of, in this case, of the actors, in this case, the legislators, and also the Capitol police officers. And then thirdly, the collaborative effort at communications amongst the folks at Network and the Federation and other groups that participated in the action raised public awareness about what was happening at a key point in time that dovetailed with the political process. And so I was quite taken to see the extent to which that seemingly all too small action on my part rippled out to a subset of people who have been thinking about this for a long time and were ready to hear it on that level, and then to choose to take next right steps for them. Because I think it was at a time when everyone was realizing, we need to step it up here, and if we're going to have any kind of effectiveness.
It seems to me that part of the effectiveness is the fact that it is nonviolent. Because if civil disobedience becomes violent, it loses its credibility. And by being disciplined and nonviolent and persevering for justice' sake, it raises consciousness.
We can probably take one more question. Oh, there we go, Marty.
Well, I was just going to simply share as well. I mean, that's a part of maybe, I will say, us as CSJs walking with the community, and that sometimes is a very difficult balancing act. And so I'll just share here in the Twin Cities, because the Whipple Federal Building has been a place, it has been the nexus of really the Operation Metro Surge here in the Twin Cities. And so it has become a focal point for many, many people of all different backgrounds and different strategies. And so part of the tension with our last vigil just a few weeks ago here was, well, do we go and show up in the space that maybe more vocal folks who use a little more colorful language or maybe other strategies? And do we still show up in that space? And so for one of the vigils a month ago, they decided to move it to a place so they would not be, quote, associated with maybe that colorful language or maybe other actions. And yet, as the sisters were planning their vigil, we said, well, no, but we need to be present. We need to be there. And maybe we bring another way to not only the federal employees and the agents, but also to other Minnesotans who are showing up in spaces. And so we gathered and did it together with other community groups. And I think that's a part of this balancing act of walking the walk of nonviolence, that we bring them to spaces that are really hurting right now. And so I shared this with some of the other justice promoters last week. Was there's a lot of pain and a lot of hurt in these spaces. And I shared that an elderly woman showed up at outside of the federal building one day and was really in a lot of pain and using more colorful language than I'm comfortable with. And yet, as I got to hear her pain and her story, she was sharing that a neighbor had been picked up and arrested, a father with several children, and she was very upset that this is a man that is no threat. And so there's a lot of pain, and yet we can bring not only nonviolence and peace, but can be there and accompany folks through that pain and work through that as well. So I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you. We filled up this hour so quickly. So grateful to our panelists for being here and for sharing their wisdom. We want to offer through the Federation just a link to upcoming other justice, peace, and integrity of creation events that we have going on. So as you're discerning your next right step and thinking about your own desire to act in a nonviolent way, we have a St. Joseph the Worker virtual vigil for economic justice on May 1st. And that's an opportunity to hear from the Catholic Labor Network, as well as some former labor organizers and potentially some families impacted economically by the detention of breadwinners or the primary economic wage earner in that home. So we'll also offer opportunities for some prayer and reflection and advocacy and mutual aid during that hour together. So keep that in mind. If you click on the CSSJFed.org events page, we're happy to connect you there. And then we do have book discussion groups coming up on the Jesus and Justice book, which is about organizing and nonviolence in our time now. So a couple of ways to engage from wherever you are on the globe and from wherever you sit in the Federation connections. And so again, we're grateful to our panelists. We'll send you the link as well as a list of some of the things they referenced in the conversation today, so that you can follow up with those, and for people who weren't able to attend, who can watch it later. So again, thank you so much to our panelists, and I wish you all a good rest of your day together.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Bethany, for organizing us.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thanks all.